Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is second bite at the cherry in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 21. There was currently only one person in the world that Gaara truly trusted, and that was Sakura Haruno. But that didn't mean that trust wasn't sometimes difficult. He had no idea why Sakura had suddenly decided to try and bring the Umbu operative into their fold. If he was being honest with himself, he actually resented it. Sure, the Umbu would be following them regardless unless they killed him, but that didn't mean they had to share their fire and food, and that didn't mean that Sakura had to waste time trying to get to know him. And maybe the real problem was that Gaara had gotten used to it being just the two of them, and he was beginning to learn that he really didn't like sharing. He didn't trust a word that came out of Sai's mouth anyway. Maybe Sakura wasn't as aware, but Gaara knew an emotional mask when he saw one. He'd dealt with his own for years before Naruto Uzumaki had finally cracked it, until Sakura had come in and started chipping away pieces. Sai wore a mask as solid as Gaara's had been, but what really irritated Gaara about it was that Sai didn't even have the decency to be apathetic with his mask. He faked emotions, smiling at Sakura's commentary, frowning when she was distressed, and even putting on a friendly front whenever he and Gaara were forced to converse. And because of those faked emotions, Gaara couldn't help but feel as though Sakura was falling for his two-bit act, hook, line, and sinker. "You could kill him," Shukaku commented, his voice so deep and thunderous it was almost like an ache in Gaara's mind. Killing Sai would make Sakura unhappy, so of course it was out of the picture. But maybe if he could convince Sakura to see reason, they could ditch this Umbu somewhere, somehow, and then it would be just the two of them again and everything would be perfect. On second thought, don't kill him. I can't stand the agony of the two of you alone together again. I've retched enough in this wretched mind space. It was a quiet night out, and small fireflies danced about in the meadow they'd set up in. He and Sakura had worked together to manipulate the earth into a small, vented hut, which meant they'd always at least have a warm space to sleep. With room, of course, for Sai. Sakura had left to use the restroom, and thus the two boys had been left alone together in awkward silence. At the very least, Sai didn't try to make small talk. The quiet was better than having to fake pleasantries. And it allowed him time to think about how to get Sai out of the picture. It was beneficial even from a neutral standpoint. The Umbu was sending information on them to dubious Konoha sources. He could be ordered to turn on them at any minute. He could be ordered to capture Sakura and return her home at any minute. It just wasn't smart to keep him around. And it would be so much easier if you just killed him. For once, Gaara couldn't help but agree with Shukaku, even if the idea was out of the picture. Strange, though, how Shukaku seemed to loathe Sai and yet, as of late, be neutral towards Sakura. You bullied me into neutrality. And since you don't like the Umbu brat, that means I can bitch about him all I want and you won't stop me. It was true. And now Gaara couldn't help but wonder if he couldn't turn this mutual disliking to their advantage. They couldn't kill, but perhaps Shukaku had ideas for how to get rid of the problem in another way. Nope. I'm not falling for that crap. You can't manipulate me, kid, I've known your mind since you were born. Maybe you can threaten well, but you're no schemer. And if you can't manipulate me you're sure as hell not getting the Umbu out of here. But wasn't that proving his own point? Gaara couldn't do it alone, but if Shukaku was willing to work with him, maybe it could be done. I said no, brat. Arjun Hiraki always so pensive. Sai's voice snapped Gaara back to the present. Shukaku had distracted him so thoroughly, damn it all, he needed to keep an eye on Sai. He didn't answer. He simply looked to Sai in a way that he hoped would convey, I would rather kill you than answer any of your stupid questions about the Jinchuriki. The look Sai gave him in return was almost certainly, there's nothing you can do to stop me from asking. Gaara really wanted to use his sand to wipe the fake smile off the boy's face. He didn't think he'd loathed someone as much since Sasuke Uchiha. You have to get him to show his true colors. Shukaku spoke up. Beat him at his own game. Do what you did with me and annoy him into complacency. As much as Gaara wasn't fond of the idea of actively interacting with Sai, Shukaku did have a point. So, for the first time, Gaara willing spoke to the boy. Are Umbu always so nosy? Sai smiled that fake, infuriating smile. It's my job to be nosy, Bag eyes. Gaara blinked. Bag eyes? Was he referring to the effects of his insomnia? Gaara should have been mad at the insult, but he was so baffled by the bluntness of the name that he actually couldn't even process anger for the first couple moments. Gaara took a breath. He could be composed. Shikaka was worse than this. I take offense to that. You really think calling people names will get them to divulge information? Umbu must be weaker than I thought. Names? You don't like it? Strangely enough, Sai looked legitimately confused. It says in my book that using nicknames can promote camaraderie, and to refer to someone by a distinguishing feature. Maybe it will work better with Harano. So Sai had chosen, the bags around his eyes. Maybe this Umbu was an idiot. At that moment, Sakura walked into the hut, humming to herself as she sat down by the fire. I think we're almost back to the main road. We're far enough north that we don't have to worry about Suna patrols anymore. It'd be nice to walk on an actual path, don't you think? Gaara nodded. And then an idea came into his mind. It was so simple he wasn't sure it would even work, but Shikaka had mentioned getting Sai to show his true colors, and now Gaara had one very easy way to do that, assuming he played his cards right. Thankfully, Sakura played right into his plan without even knowing it. So what have you two been discussing while I've been gone? Or is it all broody silence between you two still? Sai was telling me about the nicknames he came up with for each of us. Gaara responded immediately. Oh, that's actually good, brat. Well, Gaara didn't seem very fond of his. Sai admitted, turning to Sakura, with that damned fake smile still. But maybe you'll like yours better, ugly. There was a deafening silence following Sai's words. Gaara had to hold himself back, from laughing at Sai's complete and utter stupidity, and from sending him through a wall for even thinking calling Sakura that had been a go. Gaara flinched as Sakura punched Sai right in the face. It was a good hit, and it looked like it hurt. Where the hell do you get off calling me that, huh? Sai at least had the decency to look shocked. Gaara just sat back and let Sakura tell the boy off, unable to prevent a few smug thoughts from crossing his mind. Shikaka had said he wasn't a schemer but... Well, you might be capable of learning. The nicknames had been enough to make Sakura less friendly towards the Umbu, but not enough to chase him away completely. And Gaara got the feeling, now, that Sai's attentions had turned entirely onto him following that night at the meadow. It was probable that Sai hadn't thought Gaara capable of such scheming either, and that Gaara had now posed himself as more than just a physical threat. So Sai was now wary of him, and he and Sakura were now wary of Sai, yet somehow that hadn't been enough to free them of Sai's presence. Gaara was beginning to remember why he hadn't been fond of his lessons in subterfuge back at Suna. Scheming was just such a fickle process. Shikaka was right, killing was far more direct, far more effective. And after Sai's nickname fiasco, Gaara had the feeling he wasn't the only one thinking about killing Sai as they walked. They found the main road at about noon and began to follow it as it winded up the side of a rather large mountain. Gaara had known Uegakuer was hidden somewhere in a mountainside, and he found himself impressed by the notion that a village could form in a place so cold and treacherous. Even now at the mountain's base, he felt a chill through the sand that covered his skin, and he saw Sakura begin to shiver and hold her arms close to her body. Suna had forged itself in the heart of the hottest place on the continent, and Iwa, in turn, seemed to have formed itself at the coldest point. It was respectable, but now he was faced with the possibility of Sakura being a bit ill-equipped to deal with cold. His sand would protect him from the elements, but Sakura. There's a small merchant village, a couple miles from here. He heard Sai comment. For a brief moment, Gaara wondered if the Umbu could read minds. What, are you saying I should find a place to shower, so I don't look so ugly? Sakura retorted. Oh, that's an even better idea. Gaara expected an angry retort, but he was surprised to see Sakura suddenly deflate. My hair has been all limp since we left the plains. She admitted with a groan. A shower would be awesome. And maybe we could find some heavier clothes. Damn it all, she was agreeing with him. Even if, admittedly, stopping at the village seemed like a good idea. But Gaara wasn't going to admit it. So, one side road and a few miles later, they'd rented a room at an inn and Sakura had hightailed it to the shower. Sai had taken the opportunity to send out a few scrolls with those inked birds of his, likely the real reason he'd wanted to stop, and Gaara. Well, he probably needed a shower too. But for the time being, he and Sakura had several things to consider. One was what they were going to do once they reached IWA. If they started asking around off the bat about the other Jinhuriki, they'd likely fall under suspicion. At this point, they were probably considered missing nin, but IWA had been at war with both Suna and Konoha several times in the past, and Gaara doubted that they'd be looked upon fondly just by association. They had to approach the village in a manner that did not suggest that they were spying on IWA for their old villages and did not intend to start trouble. Sakura's first thought was to go straight to the Tsuchikage and offer him all the information she had on Akatsuki as a show of good faith. As a village with 2 Jinhuriki, they would likely value information that would help them keep their Jinhuriki from being stolen. Gaara's concern with their openness was that they might see Gaara for what he was and attempt to take the Ichibai for themselves, which meant that they would need to ensure Gaara was unrecognizable in order for this tactic to work. Easy enough. They'd snuck out of Suna with none the wiser, so Gaara would just keep his hood up and not demonstrate any abilities that might make him stand out. Both of them weren't exactly sure where Sai was going to fit in. He was under no obligation to help ingratiate them to the Tsuchikage, and, if he was at all loyal to Konoha, he might even consider it beneficial to his village to stop them from sharing information that Konoha was currently privy to. Sakura hoped Sai would understand that the villages all had a common enemy in Akatsuki, and that keeping secrets would simply give Akatsuki an edge, but... well, the Umbu boy was tricky, even if he was a social moron. The only consolation that the two of them had was that they were fairly certain they could defend themselves from Sai if he tried to stop them, unless the boy had been holding back when he'd come after them before. They'd cross that bridge when they came to it. The second order of affairs was money. Gaara, both by being the son of the previous Kazekage and having gone on plenty of missions, had amassed a considerate amount before leaving Suna, but they couldn't rely on his funds forever. Unless they wanted to live in the woods for the rest of their lives, they'd have to find a way to make money somehow. Which is how the two of them ended up doing odd jobs for the various merchants throughout the town. Gaara had never done D-ranked missions before, which was what these jobs would have been considered back at Suna. Painting fences, repairing roofs, even walking someone's dog, all of those were menial tasks considered beneath the Kazekage's children. Sakura, however, had done plenty of these, taking to them like it was second nature. Our Jounin instructor ran us ragged doing missions like these back at Konoha. She told him. And when Naruto left with the sage, I did a lot of these on my own to make money. I don't know if we'll be able to do these in Iwagakure proper, but I'm sure a lot of these small villages won't mind helping hands. Currently, she was browsing a small building that had a collection of warm clothes, scarves, and boots for mountain hiking. And that means we can afford to splurge on some nice clothes, so don't be afraid to pick out things that you like. Gaara had never gone shopping in such a manner before. He had always gone to a supplier that had provided him with the basics. Jumpsuits, wrappings, and a belt for his gourd, that was all he'd ever needed. Shinobi, he'd been told, weren't supposed to make fashion statements. They were supposed to blend in. They were soldiers. Konoha, it seemed, didn't have such beliefs. Sakura had immediately found the pinkest garment in the building, a long, thick scarf that she'd fallen in love with at first sight. That went in a pile along with a heavy red jacket, insulating pants, gloves, and long boots that reached up to her knees. She'd be warm, but she'd certainly stand out. Gaara remembered that Naruto, too, had worn bright orange clothing, which he supposed might have served him well during the fall when the leaves of the trees began to turn, but for every other season. And yet, Konoha Shinobi hadn't died out yet, so maybe they were just strong enough that sneaking around didn't matter. Plus, now that Gaara considered it, he'd stood out a fair amount with his red hair and massive gourd, yet he'd still managed to be fairly stealthy when the occasion called for it. So, what did that mean for him? He needed warm clothing too, and though his first inclination was towards the dullest colored jackets in the room, he wondered if Sakura might be amused if he went for something more garish. In the end, he settled for a happy medium. He'd found a brown, hooded overcoat with dark red sleeves. The coat itself reached nearly to his knees, and if he wore simple clothes beneath it, he could keep warm and experiment with his style a bit. Coupled with some hiking boots, he'd be set for the cold peaks of Iwa. Even Sai spent time finding a warm jacket for himself, and Gaara noted with a frown that he was carrying his own pocket money. He could have chipped in for the rent. He had to admit, with the new clothes, they looked different. Less like soldiers, more like people. And Gaara liked that. So ugly and bad guys aren't good nicknames, then. It was night, and Sakura had long since gone to sleep in the warmth of the inn's bed. Sai, typically, had been a light sleeper, and Gaara wasn't surprised to see him up, but he was surprised to see that the boy was still stuck on the nicknames business. I've thought about some alternatives, but clearly I don't have the mind for it. So, Gaara, what sort of nicknames would you use for Sakura, then? Or for me? Maybe you can help me find something that works. That was the last thing that Gaara wanted. If he was going to give Sai any sort of demmed nickname, it would be Dumbass. He turned to Sai. For you. Sai blinked. And then, somewhat unexpectedly, he laughed. And even more unexpectedly than that, as far as Gaara could tell, the laugh seemed genuine. Gaara couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed. Not in a way that wasn't murderous, anyway. Sakura had made him smile, had even, perhaps, gotten a chuckle out of him, but laughter still seemed out of reach at times. He'd pushed his emotions down for so long that allowing laughter to happen seemed difficult. And yet here Sai was, laughing as though it was the easiest thing in the world. Gaara felt jealous. Jealous of that ability. Jealous of that freedom. Even Anumbu, it seemed, had more humanity than him. All right then, Grumpy. Sai finally answered. I think that helps me out a lot, actually. It was like Sai really was a mind reader, calling him Grumpy now. The nickname was probably fitting, at least, and perhaps a bit less harsh than Bag Eyes. So, for now, it would be acceptable. And Gaara would learn how to laugh, even if it was out of spite. When Sai finally slept, Gaara blinked, and he was face to face with Shikaka once again. It had happened a couple times since the first, on the tower in the fortress. It was disorienting at first, but Gaara had been getting used to it quicker and quicker. He wasn't quite sure why Shikaka was dragging him in here, and, he figured, it had to be Shikaka doing it, as when he tried on his own he could never trigger the event, but in a strange way he didn't mind. Being face to face with his demon helped put the demon into perspective. You're heading into the lion's den. Shikaka began. He let out a long breath of air, and the black sand at Gaara's feet began to swirl with an unnatural energy. I've seen how Uegakuer treats its enemies. The instant they learn what you are, your lives will be in danger. I know. Gaara answered. But it is what Sakura wants to do, and it is the only way we can find the other Jinhiriki. They're all probably like you used to be. Cynical, murderous, withdrawn. They won't trust you, even if they know what you are. Not everyone's like that Kitsune's brat. We still have to try. But what do you want, brat? Shikaka huffed. You're no longer killing everything, you're just blindly following that girl without any other purpose. You went from being a tool of Suna to being a tool for Sakura. I'm not a tool. Gaara protested. I'm helping her because she's my friend. And will you die for her, too, if Iwa turns on you? The answer came out of Gaara quicker than even he could have expected. Yes. Shikaka let out a thundering growl, shifting his body underneath the chains that held him down. The bells that usually chimed had silenced, leaving the room eerily quiet. That Kuwabai boy, that's where it all started. I don't know what's gotten into Kurama that he let that boy be so insufferable, but, I suppose it might be a sign. A sign of what? That humanity might be able to change. It was, perhaps the kindest thing Shikaka had ever said to him, that admission of hope. Gaara sat himself down on the black sand beneath him. If Shikaka could be civil about things, so could he. Maybe they could even reach some sort of understanding. Maybe that had been what Naruto had done. Naruto had broken free from the loneliness of isolation. Naruto had friends who cared about him, friends like Sakura that had traveled across the continent to find information that could help him. Naruto had strength. The Kyuubi's strength, and his own strength. Had Naruto spoken with the Kyuubi like this, one-on-one? Had he helped the fox see that bonds were something to be cherished and sought out? Could Gaara too convince Shukaku of such? I want to live in a world where no one has to live in solitude and loneliness ever again. Gaara found himself saying. I want to live in a world where shinobi aren't tools to anyone. The only way such a world is ever going to exist is if someone works to change it. Then I'll be that change. We'll show all the other Jinchuriki that they have friends, even if the shinobi world shuns them. We'll bring them all together and make the world a better place. Bold. Stupid. Impossible. Shukaku huffed. And I'm stuck along for the ride, so I might as well try to enjoy it. Gaara blinked, and he was in the inn once again, though Shukaku had one more thing to say. Go out the window and get out onto the grass, brat. It's time someone trained you properly. Chapter 22. There was a chill in the Iwa Mountains that was unlike any sort of chill Sakura had experienced in her lifetime. Even with her new garments, the wind seemed to blow right into her very bones. Gaara was a blessing in disguise. He kept the wind off their backs with a thick layer of sand, something that looked like it took a reasonable amount of effort to keep up for the hours they spent hiking through the mountain trails. When Sakura asked, he said it was good training. Like she'd implemented with her sensing jutsu, long-term, continued use of jutsu would only serve to strengthen one's chakra reserves. With the Ichibai inside of him, Sakura wasn't quite sure why he needed larger chakra reserves, but she wasn't going to fault him trying to improve anyway. At night, even with a roaring fire inside their self-made huts, Sakura shivered with cold. It was near impossible to sleep, a challenge to even find food. Whatever shinobi Iwagaku were raised, they had to be strong to have grown up in this. Sakura almost envied them. Comparing Konoha to here, even to Suna, it felt as though she'd lived a sheltered life, with calm winters and pleasant summers. But, if anything, that only made Sakura more determined. Surviving the mountain, in its own way, was also training. When she returned to Konoha. If she returned to Konoha. Because she was very well still afraid of dying out here, if not from the cold, then from the shinobi who had become infamous for their hatred of other villages, Konoha in particular. But if she returned to Konoha, she wasn't going to be considered squirrel little Sakura anymore, Sakura who couldn't keep up with her teammates, Sakura who couldn't make it to the finals of the Chunin exams. Naruto and Sasuke would have thrown a fit at being subjected to these mountains, and here she was living them. Maybe she wasn't an Uchiha, wasn't a Jinchuriki, but if there was one thing Sakura was finding out about herself, it was that she could endure. She knew that Sai was desperate to know why they were heading to Iwa. Oh, he knew the details of why. He knew that they were going to speak with Iwa's Jinchuriki and pass on information about Akatsuki, but she got the feeling that Sai didn't know the motivation behind why they were doing it. Because it was the right thing to do, didn't seem quite the satisfactory reason, though Sai had written it down in his scroll regardless. Sakura supposed coming from the secretive world of the Umbu, seeing what happened behind the scenes of the hidden villages, probably made one suspicious to the intents of others, but had the boy really not heard of altruism before? But the more Sakura thought about it, the more she really thought about it, she almost had to wonder herself if it was a good enough excuse. She was doing this for Naruto, for Gaara, for all the other Jinchuriki. She was doing this to eventually find Sasuke and save him from Orochimaru's grasp. Wasn't that good enough? It had to be. But something in Sakura just wasn't quite sure she had the whole picture anymore. She had scars for this journey. Ruined her career as a Konoha shinobi for this journey. She doubted Naruto or Sasuke would have wanted this for her. She doubted her parents or Ino or Kakashi or any of the others she'd left behind would have wanted this for her. But she'd wanted it, and maybe. Deep in thought, fisticuffs. Sakura inwardly flinched at Sai's newest nickname. Apparently her punch had gotten some sort of message across about calling her names, but Sai still seemed insistent on settling upon something. She couldn't complain too much about fisticuffs. At the very least, it was more flattering than ugly. And she was so glad Ino hadn't been around to hear that comment. Well, When the cold keeps you up, not much else you can do but think. She admitted aloud. You could try something productive. Sai offered. What, like doodling? Sai was silent at this. Sakura hadn't known until recently how much Sai practiced his art, as he usually did it when she was asleep. But now that she'd found insomnia, she was learning all sorts of things that happened while she was typically asleep. Obviously Sai needed to practice to keep up his skills as an artist, but what Sakura was dying to know was how one brought something to life from a page. Can you bring anything to life? She found herself suddenly asking. I see you do animals, but what if you decided to do a sword? Would it come out sharp or would it come apart the instant you hit someone with it? Sai looked to her, his face unreadable. I'm not sure why I need to answer any of those questions. Well, he had a point. Sakura frowned and rolled her eyes. They weren't friends, not like she and Gaara. Sai was technically here to spy on her, she was just tolerating him, which was the only reason Sai wasn't hiding in a tree 20 feet away while they holed up for the night. She'd thought, incorrectly it seemed, that he might be grateful for their companionship, but maybe I'm just trying to make small talk. She finally answered. Maybe I thought we could be civil and learn about each other instead of just faking being nice. Information is never free. Then ask me something. Sakura offered. You tell me about your drawing jutsu and I'll tell you about something you want to know. She saw Gaara shoot her a look. She wasn't stupid, she knew Gaara didn't have any sort of positive feelings for Sai, but that didn't mean they couldn't try to make friends. Maybe, just maybe, if she could convince Sai that her heart was in the right place, she could convince Konoha and Tsunade too. And then she could go back, consequences be damned. Tell me how you found out I was following you. Sakura smirked. Oh, had that been nagging at Sai this whole time? Well, it wasn't as though it had been entirely her that had done it. The man with the Akatsuki robes told me. She said, not even bothering with any dishonesty. Haiden was his name. I somehow managed to liken him to me and he returned the favor by telling me about you. From there, it was a matter of using my sensing jutsu. She hesitated before speaking further. If she admitted she stole a scroll from Konoha's archives, she'd probably get more trouble than just running. Well, it wasn't as though Sai needed to learn how she'd learned such a technique. Nobody asked Sasuke where he'd learned the Chidori from, they'd just accepted that he had a new technique and gone with it. My abilities with sensing are kind of limited. My range is about 200 feet, and I can locate anyone with a chakra signature. So, once we were out in the fields, far from the plains village, the only signatures I should have been able to sense were myself and Gaara. But there you were, behind us, and that's how we found you. A sensing jutsu, Sai pulled out a scroll and began to take more notes. There's nothing in your record about ever knowing a jutsu like that before. A shinobi doesn't tell everyone their secrets. And yet you're telling me yours. It's called building trust, ever heard of it? In the shinobi world, there is no such thing as trust. As a shinobi, you should know that. Well, as a person, I can't accept that. Sakura found her voice raising. Maybe it was exhaustion, but she couldn't hold back her emotions. Do you honestly think Gaara and I managed to get this far because we were holding knives at each other's backs the whole time? No human being can possibly succeed without having people they trust. That's why genin are divided into squads. Whatever happened to your squad, huh? Sai went quiet. He looked down at his scroll, his pen faltering. I didn't have one. Didn't have one? Well, that couldn't be. Sakura was certain all shinobi were required to go through the academy and be assigned to a genin squad, even if there were some who graduated earlier than others. Bypassing a team entirely? The Hokage would never allow such a thing. As if reading her mind, Sai spoke again. Sometimes children stand out from a young age, and sometimes people in the village take notice. We of Umburu do not have teams. We are simply tools, shaped to serve Konoha. We take no names. We have no purpose but the mission. And we feel no emotions. He turned to face Sakura again, and his fake smile came to his face. So no, I never learned anything about squads or trust. Sakura felt her anger deflate at that. This boy, did such an organization really exist within Konoha? Not just Umbu, but Root, children groomed from a young age to become tools. This was not something she pictured the third or the fifth Hokage deeming appropriate, but the proof of Root's existing was standing right in front of her. Konoha it had secrets. Not just about Naruto or the nature of the Uchiha massacre, there were secrets far deeper than she'd even considered. Konoha was her home. She wanted to think the best of it. She wanted to think that only the other villages recruited soldiers so young and forced them to fight. But Konoha was just as bad as everyone else, and Sai was the proof. "I'm sorry," she mumbled aloud. "Whatever for. I'm just answering your questions, like you wanted." "I'm sorry you don't know any better," Sakura continued. "I'm sorry you never had a team or learned about the things that matter. I'm sorry you've been alone." She stole a glance at Gaara, who looked far more pensive than usual. Gaara's loneliness was a subject she'd heard about before. Even though Gaara had been assigned to a genin team, he hadn't been with people who trusted and supported him. Sai, was it possible Sai had it worse than Gaara? Sai had purpose, at least, a mission, and he claimed he wasn't supposed to feel, but no human being could exist without emotions. It was impossible. She'd learned that back in the Land of Waves, back when she'd cried over Sasuke's body, thinking he was dead, unable to be the tool that the village had wanted. And with that thought in her head, about the rules of being a shinobi, how she was supposed to suppress her emotions and put the village first, maybe it wasn't so strange that Root existed after all. Maybe she just hadn't wanted to see it. The shinobi world is a cruel place. She admitted to herself, more than Sai. That Jinhuriki even exist at all is a testament to that. That Root exists, even more so. I really think I hate it, you know. Was she actually crying? Her face was numb with cold, but the tears were warm on her face, and she noticed that Sai seemed almost shocked at the action. Because we aren't tools, we're human beings with emotions and desires and dreams, and no amount of training or conditioning is ever going to erase that. I don't believe you when you say you feel no emotions, Sai. I don't believe shinobi have to live this way. That's why I have to see the other Jinhuriki. That's why I have to be there for them. Gaara and we can show them that they don't have to be alone. That there's another way. Shinobi can learn to trust and help each other. We can learn to understand, to really understand each other. Without thinking, Sakura reached up, clutching at the Jashin amulet around her neck. You can be an emotionless killing machine and never think twice about the lives you take, but for worshippers of Jashin, every life means something. Every life, and only through knowing each other's pain could shinobi really hope to understand each other. She may not have understood Sai before, but now, after hearing just that simple explanation, she was certain she understood him perfectly. So that's it. She decided. That's the real reason we're out here, Gaara and I. To show the rest of the world that there's a better way. We're Konoha and Suna, working together. But more than that, we're friends who trust each other. She wiped her eyes and gave Sai her biggest grin. So what do you think about that, Sai? Sai looked down at his notes before rolling up his scroll. I think, you're delusional, fisticuffs. He smiled at her, but this time, Sakura could have sworn this time the smile looked genuine. Fine by me. Just you keeping watching, Umbu boy. We'll prove you wrong. They reached the outskirts of Uegakuer as the morning sun first peeked over the mountain, when half a dozen IWA shinobi appeared around them with all manner of kunao and shuriken aimed at their vicinity. It was a main road, so it wasn't as though they were traveling suspiciously, but Sakura realized all too quickly that this wasn't a normal patrol when she was addressed by name. Sakura Harano. You and your companions will surrender your weapons immediately or be executed where you stand. The woman who spoke was pretty, but carried a look about her that screamed serious. Sakura found a small sort of satisfaction in that the woman was wearing a deep red outfit that was not dissimilar to her old one. Take that, Ino, red dresses were in now. They had come here to be diplomatic, so for Sakura, there wasn't a question of what they'd do. Slowly, so that she wouldn't startle any of the shinobi trained on her, she began to remove her weapons and lay them on the ground in front of her. We're here to speak with the Tsuchikage, she announced, noticing out of the corner of her eye that Sai had yet to disarm himself. Gaara didn't carry kunao, she realized, as he could easily make his own weapons with sand. That they didn't know about Sai yet meant that their information on her and Gaara was somewhat dated, but that they had information at all was disconcerting. What news had been spread about her? And since they hadn't mentioned Gaara by name, did they know he was the Ichibai Jinhiriki? Gaara had thought Suna would keep his absence a secret and she believed him. For now, she would do whatever she could to convince these shinobi that Gaara was simply her traveling partner and nothing more. My friend here on my right doesn't carry any weapons on him. And, she looked back to Sai, hoping he'd see reason. That's a Konoha Umbu, look at the mask on his hip. She heard one of the shinobi hiss. We should just kill them all now. Quiet. The woman in front of her ordered. Harano, we know of your one companion. However, there was no information about an Umbu traveling with you. Those who are from Konoha are considered enemies to our village. With a small hand gesture, 4 shinobi flanked Sai, pushing him to the ground and twisting his arms behind his back. What reason do we have to believe that you are not working with him? Sakura winced at Sai's treatment. She didn't like seeing the boy manhandled so much, but, what could she do, in this situation? He was sent to gather information about me. She decided to go with the truth, at least, what might help the situation. I have defected from Konoha, you see, and the Hokage thought it might be to join up with another missing shinobi that defected a while back. This Umbu was under orders to follow me in the hope of learning where the other shinobi had gone, as his current status was that he defected to join the Sun in Orochimaru. A spy, then. The woman concluded. So you do not consider him an ally? Sakura grimaced. If she misspoke, would Sai be killed? We allowed him to travel with us as my intent was not to find Orochimaru's location and there was no point in hindering his mission. In that respect, as he has been at our side, I consider him an ally, but, I have no current loyalties to Konoha or any motivation to further his mission. Very well. The woman gestured again, and the shinobi vanished, Sai along with them. Sakura's breath hitched in her throat. She could only hope she hadn't condemned Sai to death, but, what else could she have done? Sai wouldn't have stayed behind if she'd asked. He'd known what he was getting into. We have no purpose but the mission. She gritted her teeth. The idiot was so damn dedicated to his mission that he might have just thrown his life away for it. You will follow me? The woman ordered. I will take you to see the Tsuchikage myself, and from there we will discuss if you are worth keeping alive. The woman turned to leave down the path, and Sakura gathered that she was expected to follow. For a moment, she felt frozen in place, terrified by what IWA had to offer her. And then Gaara's hand was on her shoulder, and she felt herself breathe again. She had someone she could trust. If things went bad, she and Gaara could rely on each other. It just pained her, in the back of her mind as she began to walk, that Sai might die without ever knowing that feeling. Chapter 23. Perhaps Sakura had been spoiled by Konoha, but Iwagakure had to be the ugliest village she'd ever set eyes on. And it wasn't that it wasn't large or grand, but all of the buildings were the same shade of rock, the same shape, the same height. Only one building in the center of the village stood taller than the rest, the Tsuchikage's no doubt, but even that was just barely less bland than everyone else. Iwa wasn't at the mountain's peak, like Sakura had been thinking. Rather, the mountain peaked in various places around the village, forming a protective barrier not unlike that Suna had found for themselves out in the desert. There was only one main road in and out of the village, and that had been the one Sakura had come in on. Trying to come in from any other angle was probably suicide, and Sakura knew that the Iwa shinobi likely counted on that. Despite its ugliness, Iwa was its own fortress, and it definitely held its defense leagues over that of Konoha's. Sakura still remembered how easily Orochimaru's snakes had torn down Konoha's walls. She doubted the snakes could breach a mountain similarly. What was interesting, however, was the transportation that the village implemented. Oh, there were sidewalks and people using them, but Sakura soon realized that the real common form of transportation in Iwa was an underground tunneling system that the shinobi simply referred to as the carts. The carts themselves were large, roofed wagons that could fit several dozen people inside of them. Each ran along a track that had been molded out of metal, and Sakura noted, after seeing a small spark, that some sort of electric current was running through the track. Whatever this current was, it gave life to the carts, allowing them to thunder their way through the depths of the mountain and come back up to whichever station was next on the track. Sakura wondered just how many carts were running at a time, and how long it had taken to get the timing just right so that the carts wouldn't run into each other, never mind the fact that they were using electricity in a way that Konoha hadn't dreamed of yet. They still used horse-drawn carts, IWA had automated carts. "You're impressed." The woman escorting her smirked as she eyed Sakura. Konoha prides itself in the power of its clans and unique jutsu. Other villages have to make up the slack in other ways. Other villages? Sakura questioned. So villages other than IWA have carts like these? Harano, you are going to be learning quite a bit about how far behind Konoha has fallen. The thought was enough to sour Sakura somewhat, but she kept face. She was supposed to be playing the part of a turncoat, not a loyal Konoha shinobi. And if she survived this, if it was possible to survive this. Though, there was another part of her that inwardly flinched at the idea of sharing Iwa's secrets with Konoha so freely. That they were being so open about it with her clearly meant that they weren't that intent on keeping the news of their technological prowess a secret, but, Konoha didn't know yet for a reason. But if she didn't tell Konoha everything she knew, then, she really would be a turncoat. She mulled on her thoughts as the cart took her deep into the heart of IWA. Gaara was silent next to her, but never strayed very far from her side, even as the cart shifted and swayed. Sakura found herself wanting to lean against him, to find some sort of stability for her shaking legs. This was so much to take in, and all before a meeting with the Tsuchikage. How was it that IWA knew about her to begin with? That was as good a place to start as any, Sakura supposed, if she was going to gather information during her time here. So she spoke to the woman again. "I'll admit, I wasn't expecting you to know who I was. It's as much a surprise as us as it is to you," the woman answered. Lord Tsuchikage had been in correspondence with Lord Hiroshi for some time, in the hopes of building trading routes between IWA and Plains. Imagine our shock when we heard that he'd been overthrown, with the aid of an as of yet unheard of rogue shinobi who had a penchant for earth jutsu. Sakura couldn't help but blush. She had a reputation? I had just been passing through. I didn't find Hiroshi palatable. Can't help but agree with you there. The woman actually smiled. He was trash, but he was valuable trash. Fortunately, the woman you left in charge was more than willing to continue our negotiations, and she did us the favor of warning us of your existence, and that you were headed in our direction. Lord Tsuchikage was wary that you might try to usurp him too, but seeing as you've so willingly disarmed yourselves, I'm thinking you might have a different reason for trekking all the way up this mountain. That would be correct. Well, you can discuss it with Lord Tsuchikage. We're almost there. The cart squealed as it came to a halt at their final destination. Sakura swallowed nervously. She'd heard stories about Onaki and his fearsome battle prowess during the Third Shinobi War, and knew from her history books that he had ruled over IWA for decades. This wasn't Tsunade she was going to speak with, Tsunade who, despite her sternness, Sakura had never been afraid of. With Onaki, she had no idea what to expect. To Sakura's surprise, she wasn't brought to the tall building she'd noted before, but rather a large one-story that dominated the majority of the street it stood by. Though it seemed a major building, Sakura saw none of the passers-by entering it, and when she was led inside, the first room was empty. It was only once she was brought into the main room that she realized that the building had to be used for training. At first, it looked like a disaster zone. Broken boulders and pillars of stone lay all across the room which would otherwise have resembled an empty arena. The arena itself had been dug about a story down into the earth, likely so that others could watch the goings-on from above without fear of harm to themselves. As Sakura peeked down into the arena, she saw 6 shinobi, all looking to be about her age, fighting each other with gusto. The boulders and pillars became weapons as earth jutsu summoned whatever happened to be closest, and as Sakura watched the shinobi get battered back and forth by stone, she couldn't help but think that, if this was some sort of training, it was brutal. She tore her gaze from that battle and looked across the room, and there she caught sight of the Tsuchikage for the first time. He was old, and the fact that he could still command the village at such an age spoke leagues about the man's leadership and battle prowess. She had thought the third Hokage had been in office for too long, but Onaki took the cake. He was surprisingly small, shorter than her by at least several feet, and it did not help that he appeared absolutely dwarfed by the man that stood at his size. The biggest man Sakura had seen in her life, and she'd seen some large Akimichis back home. Sakura was led around the room to the Tsuchikage, every now and then ducking to avoid the splinters of rock that were shot across the room. The woman escorting her did not seem fazed, so such training was likely something they were used to. Even in the Chiryunin exams, Sakura hadn't felt such danger being on the sidelines. Eventually, she and Gaara stood at the Tsuchikage's side, waiting as their escort spoke. "I've brought Harino, as you requested. And she can wait," Oniki insisted, shifting in his chair as he kept his eyes glued on the battle in front of him. "The Chiryunin exams only come once a year, and I think one of these might just have a bit of a backbone in him." There was a loud blast, and Sakura flinched as a boulder was redirected right at them. But Oniki did not flinch, or even move a muscle. He simply sat as the large man next to him swatted away the boulder with a casual flick of his arm. Sakura wondered how often this arena needed repairs. The escort returned to stand by Sakura and Gaara, now watching the match as intently as her superior. "We haven't had a Chiryunin promotion in 3 years," she admitted to Sakura. "You're lucky. It sounds like the Lord Tsuchikage might be in a good mood." Promotion. Sakura remembered vaguely that IWA had not been at her own exam. Did the village prefer their own test? It had seemed as though every other village in the country had come, but IWA, no, they definitely hadn't been there. Of course, now that she thought about it, it made sense. Distrust of Konoha and all. She watched the battle too, watched in awe as one shinobi countered a boulder missile by redirecting it upwards with an earthen pillar. The timing and precision required for such a feat, and then the boy followed it up by summoning a horizontal pillar from the wall, sending the boulder right back at his assailant. None of the shinobi, Sakura realized, were using weapons, only earth techniques. She supposed there was little a kunao could do against stone, but a well-thrown shuriken could take out an opponent with ease, so were they purposely limiting themselves? It was over soon after. The boy's redirected boulder took out 2 of the opposing team, and from there a 3-on-1 battle was a near-guaranteed victory. As soon as the third opponent was down, a nearby shinobi blew a whistle, calling a halt to the match. Winner, Team Anabi. The 3 victors looked exhausted, but they each turned in the direction of the Tsuchikage and gave a respectful bow. Sakura saw the Tsuchikage smile before giving a curt wave of his hand. "Bah! I don't need to see any more. Give Itsuki the dem jacket already, he's more than earned it." Despite his exhaustion, a large grin came to the boy, Itsuki's, face, and he bowed again, even lower. "Thank you, Lord Tsuchikage." From there, the team dispersed, though not before a few cheers were given to the newly promoted Chiryunin. Nurses flooded in to take care of the injured genin, and with that the arena began to empty until only the group with the Tsuchikage remained. "I saw the look in your eyes, girl." Oniki suddenly spoke, and Sakura realized he was speaking to her. "Finally got to see what real shinobi fight like, eh? Konoha has their special clans and secret techniques, but IWA has something even more powerful. Innovation." She heard the shinobi around her chuckle. So was that how IWA saw Konoha? Haughty and bland. She fought down the part of herself that wanted to leap to Konoha's defense. That would get her no friends here. Instead, perhaps. His finesse with Earth Jutsu was very impressive. She admitted. "It's not something I would be capable of matching." "Bah! Oh, cut the pandering crap!" Oniki suddenly shouted. "I know how you Konoha types are. Diplomatic exterior as it suits you. What do you really think, Harino?" Sakura couldn't help but wince. She did think the boy's use of jutsu was effective, that hadn't been a lie. But I would expect such finesse with Earth to be a standard of all IWA shinobi, not just the exemplary ones. Now that's a better opinion. Oniki agreed. I've watched these exams for decades. Our youngest shinobi have not grown up in the heart of war like their predecessors. There's a genius in every generation, but not every can be young Itsuki. Every shinobi here, though, is 10 times the warrior of your pathetic Konoha regardless. Sakura gritted her teeth. She was supposed to be a missing nin, but hearing that Tsuchikage talk so brazenly about her village was pushing almost all of the buttons she had to push. Had the Tsuchikage brought her to him just to trash-talk Konoha? And besides, it wasn't like she was currently associated with Konoha anyway, right? I'm not entirely sure where posturing the strength of your shinobi will get you with me. Sakura decided to go for bold. As I am no longer considered a Konoha shinobi. And yet, I've been informed you've been traveling with an agent of Konoha regardless. Onaki narrowed his eyes. A young Umbu boy. Word has spread that you have supposedly left your village. It would be a rather convenient excuse to allow you to spy upon other villages, claiming to be a rogue shinobi. If you're so convinced of my guilt, why are speaking with me? Sakura lowered her head, a bit of humility reaching her as she realized she was, in fact, speaking with a cage. If I might be so bold as to ask. Why am I indeed? Onaki looked her straight in the eyes, and Sakura got the very distinct impression that she was being judged by some unknown standard. The new leader of the plains has spoken rather highly of you. You helped organize a village revolt and aided in the defeat of a man with a rather powerful Kekkei Genkai. And now, assuming our negotiations continue as planned, Plains and Stone will become powerful allies. Now I have to wonder what exactly Konoha would have to gain from such a thing. Maybe I wasn't working for Konoha. Maybe I just wanted to do the right thing. The right thing? Interfering in village politics and disposing of a man in power simply because you thought it the right thing? Are you going to come for me next? Onaki suddenly laughed. Not like a brat like you could stand a chance against me, but I can't help but wonder what your intentions are. You aren't working with Konoha, so why leave? I'd hear it from your own mouth, girl. This was it. Her chance. In a weird roundabout way, this conversation was going as good as she'd hoped. I'm here to give you information regarding an organization called Akatsuki that might potentially mean to kidnap your village's Jinhiriki. Sakura began. If possible, I would also like to speak with your Jinhiriki myself, in an attempt to understand the nature of the tailed beasts better. My previous companion in Konoha was a Jinhiriki, and I want to keep him and others like him safe from this organization's influence. Akatsuki. Onaki's face turned into the visage of confusion, and a firm frown grew on the old man's face. And what evidence do you have that they seek Jinhiriki? The Akatsuki this village knows is but a simple mercenary group. Sakura bit her tongue, thinking back to her experience with Haiden and Kakuzu. They had simply been seeking a bounty, that was true, but all of the information Konoha had gathered on the organization had suggested they were after the beasts. So why would they be posing as a mercenary organization? Unless. It makes sense. She spoke aloud. Pose as a mercenary group so that a village comes to trust you. It allows you access to a village without arousing suspicion. IWA is known for having tight security. She glanced over to the woman who'd escorted her here, and the woman gave a small shrug. So if they wanted to approach your Jinhiriki, it's a safer bet to gain your trust, Lord Tsuchikage. That way they can gather information and find the best possible approach with minimal risk to themselves. It was smart. She wondered now if Akatsuki had tried a similar approach with Konoha, and perhaps failed, since Konoha seemed to know more about them than most. Konoha, it seemed, had information gatherers a bit more adept than other countries. Onaki had gone deep into thought, but all at once, with a wave of his hand, he summoned the nearby woman closer. Kuratsuke, you'll deal with this, then. At once, Lord Tsuchikage. The woman disappeared in a gust of wind, and for some reason being without her near made Sakura even more worried about standing in front of the Tsuchikage. Giving such information freely is unbecoming of a shinobi. But I am not so dense as to not take advantage of a good thing when it comes my way. Onaki admitted, moving to stand to his feet. Sakura heard several cracks as the older man positioned himself, wondering briefly how lethal he could be if his body was already starting to work against him. I will not allow strangers near any of my shinobi, especially not my Jinhiriki. For all you have told me, I still have no reason to believe you aren't working for Konoha in some way. He gestured for another shinobi to come forth. You will be taken to a holding cell until we decide what to do with you. I suggest, if your intentions are pure, that you do not attempt anything rash. I will not, Lord Tsuchikage. And Sakura didn't, though she could tell that being put into a cell was not necessarily a comforting experience for Gaara. But what good would resisting imprisonment do? The Tsuchikage hadn't had her killed on sight, which was probably a better treatment than most Konoha shinobi would receive, and getting on the man's good side was the only way she could guarantee any sort of chance of meeting with the village Jinchuriki. Still, she felt guilty. She had no idea where Sai was or what he was going through, but as someone who was definitely associated with Konoha still, she was certain he wasn't getting a royal welcome. Sakura sighed, plopping down on the floor with an angry huff. For the first time in a while, she felt powerless. Perhaps a small part of her had been hoping that all the details would iron out as she went, that the Tsuchikage might not be so distrusting, that maybe they could just waltz into an enemy village and not deal with the consequences. She was stupid. Stupid, stupid, stupid. I don't want to die here, she admitted to Gaara. You won't. I don't want to start a fight either. We came here to meet with the Jinchuriki, and here I was, stupid enough to think it would be easy. At the very best we're going to get kicked out and never allowed back in again. At worst, Tsuchikage figures we're traitors, tortures us, takes the Ichibai from you, and we die. That won't happen. You don't know that. Sakura snapped. I didn't know that. I got optimistic after Plains and I shouldn't have. Gaara crouched down in front of her, and Sakura's eyes met his. Strangely, the boy seemed more determined than she'd ever seen him. You're wrong. Optimism is the reason I pulled myself from the darkness. You, and Naruto, you both believed I could be something better. Would you have thought that impossible, when we first met? Sakura held her tongue. She would have, but she didn't want to admit it aloud. Not when Gaara had become her best friend. Gaara, the demon of the desert, Gaara who had killed more people than she could bear to know about, Gaara who had threatened her and her team, Gaara who had almost damaged Lee beyond all repair, Gaara who had done all those horrible things, and yet here he was, at her side in a cell in Iwagakure, ready to fight with her, die for her. And now she might just do the same for him. She couldn't help but smile, because he was right, and somehow Gaara was learning exactly what to say to lift her spirits. All right. I'll admit you have a point. I won't give up hope just yet. But if stuff goes to hell it won't. Right. Sakura nodded. It won't. The next day, she was summoned before the Tsuchikage again. She was taken to the same training building as before, only this time she was led into the actual arena itself. The room was daunting, and Sakura couldn't help but notice that there were shinobi on the upper levels, watching the scene below. The Tsuchikage awaited her, with his large bodyguard standing but a few feet behind him. Though he was much shorter than Sakura, his crossed arms and stern glare were still enough to intimidate. Sakura swallowed hard, grateful that Gaara was with her. I've been thinking long and hard about a great many things, Sakura Harino. The Tsuchikage began. About your desire to speak with my Jinchuriki. About the information you have given us. About Konoha, and about where we go from here. Do you still claim to no longer be affiliated with the place of your birth? I do. Sakura admitted. She had no choice, really, if she wanted to keep with the Tsuchikage's favor. Not barring the fact that, well, she still doubted if Konoha would take her back, after everything. Before I even consider allowing you to remain here, I will need proof of your neutrality. Oniki demanded. There was a look in his eyes, a look that Sakura couldn't quite place. With a wave of his hand, Sakura heard footsteps start from behind her. When she turned to look, she saw a familiar face. It was Sai. A haggard and exhausted Sai, but he was alive. She let out a small sigh of relief, up until the Tsuchikage spoke again. This boy has all but confirmed that he is a member of Konoha's Root Division. Root has infiltrated our lands and stolen children from within our borders to be brainwashed to its design. Root has attempted assassinations upon my life and the life of other shinobi within my village. What do you have to say to that, Harino? Stolen children? Sakura looked back to Oniki in disbelief. Already she had deduced enough from Sai to know that Root wasn't the most pure of organizations, but it had stolen foreign children for its program. How the Hokage not known about this? How had the Hokage not done something? She stammered as the realization of the Tsuchikage's statement began to sink in. I think, such actions are deplorable. No one should use a child for their ends, no matter where the child is from. That is the answer of a sane shinobi. But Konoha has allowed these transgressions to occur for decades without accepting retribution for their actions, or even accepting that they occur at all. This Umbu boy has been willingly complacent in these actions, and perhaps even participated in them. Since he cannot tell us, due to that troublesome seal, we must assume guilty. He will be executed today to send a message to Konoha. Executed? Sakura couldn't hold back an expression of disbelief. No, she couldn't allow him to be executed, she just... He was innocent, right? She looked back to Sai, desperate, but the boy had nothing to say. Of course, how could he have anything to say with that stupid seal? But maybe if he could just look her in the eyes, she would know that he hadn't at least directly participated in any of this. But he didn't look. He merely hung his head as he was forced to kneel down on the ground, arms restrained. I give you this opportunity, Harano. The Tsuchikage continued. If you truly no longer have any loyalty to Konoha, then you can admit to yourself that this execution is just. If so, then I ask you execute this shinobi yourself. If you do this, I will allow you and your companion to meet with my Jinhuriki, and you will have my full cooperation and consent to remain in IWA for as long as you desire. Execute Sai? She couldn't. She just couldn't. Already the thought of taking another life made her sick to her stomach. She thought of the plains shinobi, burnt into a crisp at her hands, an image that still, occasionally, haunted her dreams. That had been more accident than purpose. This would be willingly taking a life. She wouldn't be able to turn back from this. And it was Sai. Maybe Sai was a little wrought around the edges, maybe his nickname's a little harsh, but he was a person, a boy who was just as much a victim to Root as anyone else. What if I refuse? Then you will be escorted out of the village and never allowed to return. The Umbu will be executed regardless. It is better treatment than an ally of Konoha deserves. So Sai was doomed to death regardless of what action she took. All because he had followed her here. All because of her. She really was stupid. The logical part of her brain argued that she should at least take advantage of the opportunity being offered. Sai was doomed either way. If she got over herself, and did what needed to be done, she could meet with the village Jinhuriki. Do what she came to do. She and Gaara would be safe in IWA, they could learn, they could. But she'd be killing Sai, the other part of her brain argued back. She'd be killing someone who could be innocent. Who had spoken with her, listened to her, shared pieces of himself with her. And he was going to die today, at her hands or the hands of another. Sakura looked to Oniki, trying not to show how desperately she was arguing with herself. His face was unreadable. The face of someone who was steadfast in what needed to be done. The Tsuchikage would not change his mind, Sakura deduced. There was no possible way, no way to save Sai's life today, was there? No way at all. She drew her kunao, and next to her, she saw Gaara tense. Sakura. Trust me. She had already acted stupid by coming here. Already hadn't thought enough steps ahead to know that this kind of situation had been inevitable. She'd dragged Sai into this, and she was about to drag Gaara into this too. But, as she'd told Gaara, they didn't have to be killers. Something in Sakura clicked. This wasn't just about Jinhuriki anymore. This was about IWA and Konoha, and it was in her hands. Kill Sai, and Konoha would never take her back. It might even start a war, if it was found out that IWA was responsible, whether or not her involvement was learned. This action, killing Sai, there was no good ending to that story. Didn't the Tsuchikage know that? Couldn't he see that this wasn't a solution? If he couldn't, well, she would make him see. She stopped in front of Sai, looking him in the eyes before reaching down and cutting his bonds free with her kunao. She turned to face Oniki, defiant and feeling more powerful than she had any right to. I won't perpetuate the violence. You have no proof this boy has done anything wrong, and killing him would only spark war between Stone and Leaf. If you're looking for an excuse to start a war, you will not find it with me. And are you prepared to die by those words, girl? Onaki's eyes met her own again, with that same unreadable expression. Is this Umbu worth your life? There was no hesitation from her. Not anymore. Yes. Strangely, Onaki smiled, and Sakura wondered if maybe, just maybe, something was up. Then prove it, Sakura Haruno. Onaki demanded. Prove it, and defend him with your life. All at once, the other shinobi in the arena disappeared. Only Onaki was left behind, and in the blink of an eye, he was coming. Sakura's first thoughts were that if she fought a Kage, she would die. Her second thought was that if the Tsuchikage had been taking this seriously, she would have been dead already. 2 paces. The Tsuchikage had taken 2 paces towards her, and in her mind's eye she began to calculate how much time she had before it was too late. There had been 2 shinobi escorting Sai into this arena, and Onaki had a bodyguard, all of whom had left. Plus, there were shinobi in the upper area, watching this battle. The Tsuchikage had chosen an arena for this exchange, knowing, perhaps, that it would come down to a fight one way or another. Which meant, of course, that this had never been about Sai to begin with. The Tsuchikage had been testing her. 4 paces. She saw flickers of sand, and she knew, without a doubt, that Gaara would protect her. But would he protect Sai? There was no way she had the skill needed to take down a Kage, and there was no way Onaki hadn't put that together. Unless, of course, he'd assumed that in her takedown of Hiroshi, she was stronger than she seemed. But this wasn't about beating the Tsuchikage, it was about protecting Sai. And that was something she had just sworn to do with her life. Prove it, Onaki had asked. And she would. 2 things happened at once. The first was that a wall sprung up around her and Sai Gaara's sand, to Sakura's relief. The second was that Sakura slammed her hand down onto the ground without thinking, and summoned forth a pillar of earth right where she predicted Onaki would land. As Gaara's sand crumbled back to the ground, she saw a pile of dirt land where Onaki had once stood. An earth-style substitution, and a quick glance around the room revealed that the man had reappeared behind her. She instinctively moved between him and Sai, and by that time Gaara had made his way over, already summoning forth more sand around them. As Onaki charged again, the sand gathered and solidified into a ball around them. Gaara's ultimate defense. Sakura felt a rumbling slam as the Kage's attack landed against the sand, but the sand held. And there they sat, in total darkness. Sakura took a quick breath before reaching into her pocket for a match. She'd picked some up at the small mountain village, remembering the last time she'd been in such a situation. The match flickered to life, and she was greeted by the determined visage of Gaara, and a rather confused Sai. You should have killed me, Sai commented. It would have gotten you what you wanted. And I told you, I'm not a killer. And, I told you I'd prove you wrong, didn't I? She gave Sai a smile. We can make the world a better dash. She was cut off as another of the Kage's techniques slammed against Gaara's wall. A be better place. She finished, wondering how long Gaara could hold. You seem real confident there, fisticuffs. Sai, now is really not the time to sass me, considering we're the only things standing between you and death. And since she really wasn't sure how long Gaara could hold, she needed to go onto the offensive. She needed to come up with a plan. She had been the smartest kunoichi of her year, she just needed to sit down and think. The arena, it had been huge, but she could see it in her mind, see the fallen pillars and boulders from the battle before. She knelt down and began to draw an outline of the arena in the dirt, estimating their own position and using a quick sensing jutsu to determine where the Tsuchikage was attacking from. He was moving, rapidly, probably using close-range jutsu to attack. The first thing she needed to do was get him away from their defense, or else Gaara wouldn't last. She reached into her pouch, pulling out some explosive tags. Well, this attack had worked before, and while she doubted she could catch a Kage off guard enough to kill him, she could at least distract him enough to put a halt to his barrage of attacks. It would require a well-timed tunneling technique, a rapid use of her sensing jutsu to determine Onaki's location, and, well, a bit of luck. She took a deep breath, and activated her sensing jutsu. One pulse. To the forward right, moving to the left. If he kept up that pathway. She put the match between her teeth, ignoring the heat of the flame as she made the hand signs required for the technique. A tunnel appeared before her, and without even asking, Gaara handed her a small ball of earth. She put an explosive tag around it, dropped it into the hole, and then Raseo led the tunnel. Then, her sensing jutsu again. The cage's energy had quickly flickered to the other side of the room, no doubt in an effort to avoid her technique. But that had given her a quick break, and Gaara as well, though. The sand around them began to falter. Even Gaara had his limits, it seemed, though he managed to keep a single wall between them and Onaki. A single wall would have to be enough. Just focus on defense, Gaara. Sakura called out, preparing to make another tunnel. Now that they were no longer encased in sand, she could at least see Onaki, which meant no need to waste chakra on her sensing technique. Now, it was their turn to attack. Her hands rapidly flew as she created tunnel after tunnel, using bomb after bomb in an attempt to keep the cage at bay. She couldn't help but notice a smile on the old man's face. Was he enjoying this battle? But she couldn't keep this up for long. She only had so many explosive tags, and it wasn't as if she had time to write more in the heat of the moment. And then she felt a tap on her shoulder. Give me a scroll and some ink. I don't have any blank ones. Sakura protested. But, was Sai actually trying to help? Well, she supposed it made sense, his life was on the line. All I have are my storage scrolls, and, well, she wasn't going to let him draw all over her sensing scroll. It doesn't matter. The storage scrolls will do if I can find a blank space. Well, if he was sure. Sakura obliged, handing him one of her storage scrolls, as well as her ink brush. Sai quickly unraveled the scroll on the ground, finding an empty corner and scrolling quicker than Sakura would have thought possible. Small birds came to life from the page, flying past her, around Gaara's wall, and towards the Tsuchikage. Now, Onaki had to deal with Sai's birds and Sakura's attacks. She would be out of explosive tags soon, but since she had line of sight, she could use her reverse tunneling to attack the man with pillars instead. If they could land just one hit, it was possible that would buy them enough time to start heading for the arena's exit. Of course, they'd have all the other IWA shinobi to contest with. All the shinobi that hadn't joined the fight with their cage. They were simply watching, as though Onaki himself had ordered them not to interfere. This wasn't serious. This was a test. Onaki had wanted to see how far she'd go to keep Sai alive, and damn it all, she was going to show him. What mattered now, more than anything, was that she had to get at least one solid hit on that bastard. The old man was stupidly fast for his age, and he was small enough that it made him a difficult target. Plus, he had encased his fists in rock, similar to the newest technique Sakura had picked up, and was using it to effortlessly smash through her and Sai's attacks. He was on the defensive, but it wouldn't be for long. These techniques were draining her chakra, and if it was an endurance battle, Sakura would assuredly lose. She needed to make the opening, and fast. She looked down at the diagram at her feet, and all at once she saw it. The opening. There was one part of the arena where boulders and pillars had fallen just so. If Onaki was distracted, the shadow of the debris might just disguise a well-placed tunnel. All they had to do was maneuver him to that spot and then. Well, she wasn't quite sure she wanted to use the last of the explosive tags on this. She might need them for the escape from the village. But there was something else she could do. Something stupid and reckless that might pay off even more than the explosive tags might. Gaara, Sai, I need you to direct him here. She drew an X on the spot she'd noticed. And then, Gaara, I'm going to need your help with something. A few hand signs later, she'd made the tunnel that she needed. This time, she wouldn't be using a ball of sand for ammo. This time she'd be using herself. Gaara, watch me. She ordered, quickly running through the hand signs needed to reseal the tunnel she'd made. Once I'm in the tunnel, I need you to seal it behind me. But Sakura dash. I'll jump in once the Tsuchikage is in position, so you won't have long. You'll need to be quick, but if we time this right, I'll pop up on the other side, and I can use the momentum to get a hit on him. I'll be like a human arrow under the ground. It's too dangerous. But it will probably be hilarious. Gaara and Sakura both glanced at Sai, who had an unreadable smile on his face. If it weren't for the fact that Gaara was focused on his sand defense, Sakura feared he might have killed the Umbu. Don't worry about me, we just need to do it. Trust me, Gaara, I'll be alright. And I need to know you'll have my back. Of course I will. Gaara answered, though he still sounded unsure. But they didn't have time for unsure. Sai had started up his barrage of ink birds again, and the Tsuchikage was almost in position. Sakura took a deep breath, and she dropped into her hole. With a crouch, she positioned herself in the direction the tunnel would be sending her. Then, she made a single hand sign. She felt a push behind her as the tunnel began to seal, shooting her towards the other end. At the same time, she pushed chakra to her hand, and began to draw the earth around her fist. Sakura Haruno rocketed out of her tunnel faster than even her own eye could process. But she didn't need to see to know that her punch had landed, and it had landed hard. The force sent Oniki rocketing backwards into the nearby wall of the arena, and she heard a sickening crack as both wall and man collided. She'd hit a cage. She'd hit a cage. The old man landed on his feet, of course. A testament to his rank, of course. Sakura hadn't expected to seriously injure the man with her hit, but the fact that she had landed the hit regardless was enough to make her swell with pride for a brief moment. What she didn't expect was for the man to immediately start laughing. His laugh was hearty and strong, and as he stood Sakura heard several more crack as he straightened. Son of a bitch, you popped my back. Not even Akatsuka's been able to pull that off. Sakura let out a small groan. All that work and she'd just helped the man out? If all she could manage was to crack an old man's back, then maybe she hadn't gotten stronger after all. But, even more strangely, Oniki did not make a move to attack them again. He simply continued to laugh as he walked forward towards Sakura. She was wary, but it soon became apparent that, whatever this fight was, it was over. You see, that's what I'm talking about. Innovation. Oniki continued. I've never seen a technique as stupidly reckless as that before, but damn if that wouldn't have knocked most men clean to Kumagakuer. He laughed for a moment longer before clapping his hands together. Alright, I'm sold. You're the one I've been looking for after all. Looking for? Sakura was, to put it mildly, baffled. Just what was this whole fight about, anyway? I needed to make sure you had the gumption to back your convictions, Haruno. And you've sure got more gumption than anyone I've seen in quite a long time. Nobody's been able to land a hit that good on me in decades. You've got the strength of mind and the strength of body. Just the kind of shinobi I've been looking for something big. Something big. Sakura felt her knees begin to wobble as the weight of the fight sunk in. She felt Gaara's arms around her all at once, holding her up. Which she was infinitely grateful for. The last thing she needed was to pass out in front of the Tsuchikage. Sakura Haruno. Oniki continued. What would you say to helping an old man save the world from itself? Save the world. A million thoughts seemed to pass through Sakura's head all at once. Of all the things she had been expecting out of meeting with the Tsuchikage, hearing those words hadn't been among any of her top expectations. Saving the world. What sort of madness had she gotten herself wrapped up in by coming to IWA? Sakura said eloquently. Excellent. Oniki beamed. Let's talk over dinner. Chapter 24. IWA food was hearty and warm. Sakura had been served something akin to a stew, using thick vegetables she'd never tasted before and tender meat from the goats that populated the mountainside. It wasn't spicy, not like Suna food, but it was flavorful and comforting. Sakura found herself wanting to learn the recipe. And thinking, briefly to herself, that Naruto would love the dish. Hearty and warm also seemed to describe Oniki, now that they were no longer on opposite sides of a battlefield. He cracked jokes with his fellow shinobi, gave them hell when appropriate, and laughed loud and long when something caught his amusement. It was strange, at first. Sakura had read so much about Oniki at Konoha, about how menacing he was on the battlefield, How ruthless, distrusting. But now he could have easily passed for someone's crotchety grandfather. Which he was, Sakura came to realize. Her woman escort, Kurotsuke, was his granddaughter, and there was a sort of established banter between them wherein Kurotsuke would do her best to be respectful and Oniki would go above and beyond to attempt to elicit a reaction. Sakura thought of her parents, still at home, wondering, perhaps, if she was still alive. She'd never been terribly close with her family, not like this. Her father worked hard, a civilian architect, and her mother volunteered at various places in the village. The Harano family were hard workers, she'd been told, and even though Sakura was the first shinobi of her family line, it had been expected that she would work hard too, and succeed. There was no time for playing around. No time to tease or taunt. So she'd studied and read and played everything by the book and, now here she was. She didn't want to linger on what her parents would think of her now. A missing shinobi. A traitor. Gaara too seemed equally quiet in the face of such a boisterous family. He wouldn't have had anything like this, Sakura realized, or, maybe would have been kept from it. She could picture witty Tamari and hot-headed Kankuro in a debate at the dinner table, but no matter how hard she tried she couldn't picture Gaara with them. Something, she supposed, she could relate to him about. So in the heat of the moment she nudged Gaara with her hand, letting a mischievous grin come to her face. Come on, Gaara, you need to eat up, or you're never going to get taller than me. Gaara turned beet red at the statement, something that Sakura couldn't help but giggle over, but she was drowned out by Oniki's sudden outburst. Don't you listen to her, boy, I've been Kage for decades and I haven't needed an inch. That's fair. Sakura retorted. If you'd been a couple inches shorter, Lord Tsuchikage, I might have missed my punch. The man's laughter seemed to overwhelm the table, and though Kurotsuke looked abashed, Oniki was only egged on. See, that's what this girl has that you don't, Kurotsuke. Gumption. And she's gonna need it to keep the cage in line, I'll tell you that. It was as good a time to ask as any. So Sakura cleared her throat and began. So, what exactly do you think I'm going to be doing for the villages anyway, Lord Tsuk-. Bah, just call me Oniki, for now, Harano, we can't waste time with that mouthful every time you want to speak with me. Oniki pushed away his dish and folded his arms, shifting gears as the conversation did. Do you know, Harano, why Iwa is so leery of Konoha? No, Lord, Oniki. In the early years, when I was quite young, your first Hokage Hashirama tried to broker peace between the 5 new villages, you see. He was the one who offered us tailed beasts, so that there might be balanced power between us. We bickered for weeks on borders and treaties and the like, but eventually my predecessor came to an agreement and we were at peace. Oniki pulled a small pipe out from his coat and began to light it as he spoke. And then he came. He. Madara Uchiha. The name sent a small shiver down Sakura's spine. Not just because Madara was a village founder, not just because he was an ancestor of Sasuke, but because she'd seen the waterfall that had resulted due to Madara's battle with the first. Madara was a legend. A nightmare. Hashirama desired peace. Madara, however, only desired control. He waged battle against myself and the second Tsuchikage in an attempt to get Iwa to bow to Konoha. And while he did not succeed at the time, it was luck that he did not get the chance to come finish his work. Luck and the work of Hashirama. But the seeds of doubt had already been sown. If Hashirama could not control one Uchiha, how could he control an entire clan? And for that matter, how could we? Sakura shivered again. Madara Uchiha, strong enough to take 1-2 Tsuchikages. This part, she hadn't known. And why would she? Madara may have turned against Hashirama, but he was still a founder, still an Uchiha. The clan that was the pride of Konoha, it couldn't take such slander. Even if it was true. I couldn't blame him, you know. Oniki continued, sending a small puff of smoke into the sky. If I'd thought for a moment that I could dominate Konoha, I would have. I have tried, in the past. War is easy when you have doubts and ambitions for your village. We all think of ourselves in our own, at the end of the day. You may not swear loyalty to Konoha anymore, but you cannot deny that you still feel a desire to aid them. That if they called, It would be difficult not to answer. It was true. Sakura held her head low, unwilling to answer when Oniki already knew the truth. Konoha was her home. Wasn't it? This is why, Harino. Why the villages can never have peace. So long as we seek our own benefit, we will only rarely work for the benefit of others. Only when our goals align. If we want peace, we need someone who is willing to go between. Someone who can force compromises. Someone who can work for the good of all shinobi and not just their own. I am an old man, Harino. I think now about the village I will leave behind and I am afraid. But if you and I can create something peaceful, something everlasting, I could rest easy. But you said it yourself, I still feel for Konoha. Sakura protested. Why me? Why trust an enemy at all? I just saved a Konoha Umbu from execution dash. But you did not do it because he was of Konoha. Oniki argued. You did it because it was right. If that Umbu had been from any other village you would have done it, and that was what I saw in you. In our fight. You have ties to Konoha, but now? Now you have ties to others. People. Places. Plains and their leader owe you a debt. How did it help Konoha to aid them? Plains has no alliance with anyone but us here in IWA, and even that you did not know of. You aided them because you saw a cruel man in Hiroshi and could not help but act. That is what is needed. What will be necessary in the days to come, or else we shinobi will destroy each other. There was another breath of smoke from the man, and he chuckled. You say you came here to learn of Jinchuriki. Your teammate, given what Konoha has done in the past, it is correct to assume he contains the Kyuubi? Born to be a tool of war. All Jinchuriki are. Sakura avoided giving Gaara a glance. Oniki didn't know yet, couldn't know. But in a peaceful world, such things would not be necessary. The Jinchuriki, just simple containers for the beasts. You want to protect your teammate? Ensure a world where those like him needn't be used. I get it. Sakura nodded. But, I don't know if I'm really the person you want. I'm not Madara. I wouldn't have been able to protect IWA from him. If I'm supposed to be neutral, I'd need to be strong enough to prevent the villages from killing each other, and I'm not, I couldn't be. You're wrong. Sakura blinked as Gaara spoke up, for the first time since dinner had began. You're wrong. He repeated. You can be strong enough. But you can also, he looked away, uncharacteristically embarrassed. Be kind enough. And Sakura couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed herself. He's right, you know. On both accounts. You will need strength, but more importantly, diplomacy. Stop the fight from happening to begin with. Kuratsuka spoke up this time. Diffuse the hotheads and appeal to both sides. There's no need to fight if people are not dissatisfied. And if both sides believe that you understand their perspective, they can trust you. I get the feeling you guys have been sitting on this idea for a while. You could say that. Oniki smirked. We were waiting for an opportunity, you might say. And here you come along, like fate. I had originally intended to groom an IWA genin, but the other villages might be more liable to believe my intentions if I work with someone who is Konoha affiliated instead. You know as well as anyone that we are infamous for our feuds. To say the least. Sakura took a deep breath. I'm still not sure it's me you want. But I am already planning on traveling to a few places to speak with Jinchuriki. I could breach the subject to others. Then we have a start. Oniki nodded. If you pledge yourself to this project, I will openly pledge myself to it as well. Plains will no doubt sign on, given what you've done for them. That's 2 villages dedicated to a neutrality project already. You just have, how many other damn villages are there again? No more than a dozen. Kuratsuki answered methodically. Waterfall is close by, and Sound, that's been newly founded. There's Cloud, Hot Water, Mist, Grass, Leaf, Sand. A lot, Sakura realized, a pit in her stomach growing. This project was huge, and the Tsuchikage seemed so confident, but she just couldn't find the gumption Oniki claimed she had. How could she possibly coerce every village to get along? How could she? Harano. Sakura snapped to attention, getting a laugh out of Onaki. You don't think I plan to send you into this unprepared, do you? That had been my impression. Incorrect. If we do this, we ensure it's done right. And that, my girl, that means training you up so you can knock some sense into us Cage. Onaki grew serious, and his smile turned devious as he looked to Sakura. And you'll be given the prestigious honor of training under me. Sakura swallowed hard, and Onaki just laughed. I just think he's out of his gourd, Gaara. I am a missing shinobi from Konoha, barely even a genin. I accidentally overthrow one shinobi and he wants to pin this huge diplomatic project on me. Sakura needed time to vent, Gaara realized. She was a very loud person, whether she admitted it or not, and sometimes she just needed to get her voice out. He was quiet while she talked, which she seemed to like, and he didn't mind listening. He was suspicious to Onaki's intentions. There had to be more to it than this, but what bothered Gaara was that Sakura couldn't believe herself worthy of the project to begin with. Buried deep within Sakura, coming out only when it was the two of them, was the shattered remnants of Sakura's self-esteem, if there was anything left of it at all. She always viewed herself as an inferior shinobi. The one who let Sasuke down. The one who couldn't stand at Naruto's side. She just couldn't see it. Couldn't see what she'd accomplished. Teenage girls and self-esteem problems go hand in hand, kid. You just haven't seen enough women. What do you think, Gaara? Am I being stupid for even considering this? Sakura had turned to him now. He said he'd train me. Me. Trained by the fucking Tsuchikage. Me. Sakura Harano. A civilian genin with nothing interesting under her belt. Sakura. Gaara repeated. You're wrong. I got lucky, Gaara. And you have been protecting me this entire way. It's not like it's me alone doing this. And you won't be alone if you continue to do this. Sakura let out a small sigh, but Gaara caught the hint of a smile on her face. Yeah, I know that, Gaara. I wasn't trying to say I'm kicking you off the team or anything. I just feel like, well, he'd be better off teaching you, you know. You've got more to you than I do. She's right, I am pretty awesome. Gaara mentally told Shukaku to kin it. He was about to speak again when suddenly there was a knock on the door. Sakura groaned slightly before going to answer, and as Gaara watched he caught sight of Sai as Sakura opened the door. Great. He's being released into your custody for the moment. He heard the woman, Kuratsuke, announce. If you can't watch him, he's to be under IWA guard. Oh, so that's why this apartment has 3 bedrooms. The Tsuchikage had granted them living quarters, since they were his guests. Gaara, of course, couldn't tell them that he couldn't sleep without raising suspicion, but he'd been more than curious when he'd found 3 bedrooms in their little block. Now, of course, it made sense. He'd been enjoying the privacy with Sakura, damn it all, and now the Umbu was back. Sai was blissfully silent, at least, and Gaara got the brief satisfaction of seeing the boy in handcuffs before he was promptly relieved of them. From there, it was back to fake smiles and Sakura. Well, it wasn't just the two of them anymore. Gaara had heard about the concept of jealousy, but experiencing it firsthand, he had to admit it was a more souring feeling than others had described it. He remembered vaguely the feeling of jealousy as a child, wishing he had friends, a family that loved him, but all of those feelings had washed away when. Feeling bitter, Gaara quietly slipped through a window and made his way to a roof. Sai wasn't stupid enough to attack Sakura here, and IWA wouldn't have put this much effort into making Sakura comfortable just to assassinate her later. He could allow himself a moment of solitude. Something he hadn't had in weeks now, Gaara realized. How long had they even been traveling? I still say you should kill him. Gaara felt bad that he agreed with Shukaku in this instance. But he'd been dealing with those thoughts since Sai had joined them. He could train, while he was up here, instead of feeling sorry for himself. Fine, I get the hint. Focus your chakra, brat, and make sure the layer's thick this time. Gaara did so. It would be a lie to say this training hadn't been inspired by a certain Konoha Taijutsu specialist, but Gaara had been surprised that Shukaku had paid enough attention to come up with the idea in the first place. The point had been made that Gaara's taijutsu was atrocious, and if they ever faced an enemy that could counter Gaara's sand effectively, he would be, as Shukaku put it, shit out of luck. So Shukaku had devised a training strategy, and the first step was pushing Gaara's body to its limits. Gaara already had learned to maneuver naturally with a layer of protective sand, which was fairly heavy. Shukaku had shown him, after demanding Gaara release the layer, that this had actually trained his muscles somewhat. Similar to how Rock Lee's weights had functioned. If Gaara continued to thicken the layer while he trained, using dense, heavy sand, his body would be that much stronger when the sand was removed. So Gaara compacted the earth around him, mixing it with his sand and creating a thick layer that weighed him down significantly. From there, Shukaku began to teach. Gaara found it odd that the Ichibai knew a taijutsu style, and even odder that it wasn't a style that was taught at any Suna academy. The forms favored deep stances, drawing power from the hips and from the stability the forms relied upon. When his sand layer was on, the sheer weight he carried with him would make him impossible to easily move, if he held stance. When the layers were off, his raw punching power would increase significantly, especially now, as Shukaku said, that he was learning it the right way. This style existed long before you were born, brat. Shukaku began to lecture as Gaara practiced forms. Each of these kata demonstrates potential killing blows. Now bend your legs further. Push your knees in. This stance is the stance of the half moon. Each breath draws upon chakra and builds it within you. This is the form of a man who will not be moved. He definitely wasn't going to be moving after practicing these stances. His body was going to hurt too damned much to move. Don't sass me, brat. And straighten your back. Gaara listened. He'd never been one to disobey Shukaku, after all. But as he practiced, he couldn't help but wonder where Shukaku had picked up the knowledge of such forms. The first Jinhiriki, perhaps? Nah, it was before that time, kid. Before your shithole of a village sealed me away. Shukaku sounded wistful. Remembering a better time, perhaps? You could say that. Gaara took a deep breath, visible in the air as the temperature continued to plummet with the coming night. Having the sand around him helped keep him warm, but Gaara still found that he wasn't very fond of the cold. It brought a strange ache to his body that he wasn't used to. He wasn't used to pain at all, really. Coupled with the soreness of his nightly training, Gaara's body felt absolutely miserable. But he was getting stronger. And if he got stronger, he could keep Sakura safe. All at once, energy appeared. It was like a rush, hitting him all at once and causing his sand to rile around him. Gaara only remembered feeling an energy like this once before, and that had been Naruto. But Naruto couldn't be here, which meant. He turned to meet the energy face to face, and he saw a giant of a man. The man towered over him by at least 2 feet, if not more. He was covered in an armor that was a staggering red and brown, even shrouding the lower half of his face with it. Atop his head was a wide-brimmed hat, also red. The man stood out, and yet Gaara had not felt his presence until mere moments before the man's arrival. He was strong. And as Gaara saw his eyes squint, he realized the man was smiling at him. Hello. Gaara hadn't realized it, but he'd subconsciously dropped into the new stance, hands held out in a defensive position. Maybe this man was a Jinhiriki, but, well, he remembered how he used to be. How stable was this man? Or was he more similar to Naruto? I'm Han. The man continued. With a small grunt, he sat down on the roof, still large enough that he was almost at Gaara's eye height regardless. I heard Miss Harano was here to speak with Jinhiriki, but I hadn't heard she was with one. We haven't told anyone. Gaara replied immediately. This man, he could put them in danger, if word spread about who Gaara was. Oh. Well, that's fine. There was silence, and Gaara held his stance as he regarded the man. Han simply watched him in return, speaking only after the silence had become unbearable. So what's your name? Gaara. And you're with the Ichibai? You must be from Suna, then. I've met a few people from there. Usually had to kill them, though. Han let out a sigh that sounded melancholy. But I don't like killing them, you know. You don't. Gaara had been told that all of the tailed beasts were ravenous, bloodthirsty monsters. And even if he and Naruto had learned not to listen to their beasts, that didn't change that Shukaku enjoyed fresh blood and the Kyuubi had attacked an entire village. Well, it's the damn horse, that's why. Always a bloody pacifist. A pacifist beast? Kokuo prefers to stay out of fights, if we can help it. But sometimes the village needs us. That's why we were put together. Now, Rashi on the other HA-. Energy hit Gaara like a wave all at once again, and in a blink Gaara saw a new man appear, slamming a hand over Han's mouth. Gaara first noticed a shock of red hair, similar to his own, before taking in magenta robes and a pointed headpiece. Han, what did I tell you about spouting off to the enemy? You said you were just coming to look. Han gently peeled the other man's hand off with ease. He's the Ichibai, Rashi. He's just like us. Oh boy. He'll kill us in our sleep that much easier then. I remember when you said that about me. Han answered pleasantly. And now you can't fall asleep unless I dash. Rashi slammed his hand back against Han's mouth with enough force to rock the man's head slightly. And the monkey? Great. Now I'm doomed for a headache. Gaara wondered briefly if he might be too. But they were here, right here in front of him. Other Jinchuriki. And even if one of them seemed rather loud and unfriendly, they weren't, like he had been. And they had each other. Gaara had been expecting the worst. People like him, shunned, hateful, murderous. Maybe a small part of him had hoped to help other Jinchuriki like Naruto had helped him. Whatever the case, he had the feeling he had his hands full with these two. Sakura Haruno was an illogical oddity. He had expected strangeness when he had been ordered to trail her. Only a strange shinobi would abandon their home for any reason. He had also expected to find her in the arms of Sasuke Uchiha, given her runaway note and what others in the village had to say about her. In fact, Danzo had been counting on this. What he hadn't expected had been to find the girl halfway into Suna territory with a Jinchuriki in a newly formed, freshly revolted plains village. And he especially hadn't expected her to locate him nearly instantly without so much as a telling glance towards his location. The capture and interrogation was expected, after being caught. The letting him go, illogical. By all accounts it would have been better if they'd killed him. So why had she insisted that he be let go? And for that matter, after everything, why did she risk her life to protect him from the Tsuchikage? There was something strange about Sakura Haruno all right. Something that Sai just wasn't fitting together. She preached about friendship and trust, but nobody got this far from home with this many allies on just hopes and whims. Sakura had some sort of plan. Some sort of true agenda. The logical part of Sai's mind knew this. Another part, a part he buried, a part he refused to listen to, wondered if he just might like this Sakura Haruno a little bit. From one route to another. The target has made contact with the Master of Stones. Target seems to have taken a favorable position under the Master. She acts as though she has purpose, but this purpose is yet an unknown. She seeks containers, but perhaps also seeks to elevate her own status in the shinobi world. It is possible ambition motivates her. It is as though she is a sapling who has branched off from the tree. I have yet to determine what sort of tree she will become. No sign of the heir of flame. The sand container still keeps careful vigilance over the target. From one route to another. If the target grows too tall, trim the tree and let the sand fall to dust. Chapter 25. It was surprisingly easy to fall into a routine. Sakura woke up early, long before she knew Oniki would be able to get himself out of bed, and she and Gaara went to what the locals called Training Ground Zero. It was a mess of a stadium, something more akin to a crater than an actual arena, and the rough rubble made it difficult to keep one's footing. Kuratsuka told her that a man named Deidara had dropped an experimental bomb there, once, in the years before he went rogue. The explosion had melted away rock and stone, weakening the ground and leaving the crater behind. The official story was that IWA had found use for it as a training ground and that was why they hadn't filled it back in yet, but the truth, Kuratsuka whispered in her ear, was that it would take mining half a mountain to fill it again, and IWA wasn't willing to waste resources on that. In a weird way, Sakura was grateful that it existed. With the ground so unstable, few people trained there, which meant for most mornings she and Gaara could train together at their leisure. Shukaku, it seemed, had been teaching Gaara taijutsu. This was something she jotted down into her own notes, as it not only brought up the interesting thought of tailed beasts remembering things like taijutsu to begin with, but also suggested that Shukaku was becoming easier to work with. She wasn't sure if that was exactly the right way of going about it, but if Shukaku was willingly sharing information with Gaara, willingly teaching him, that meant tailed beasts weren't horrible, murderous monsters. They could be reasoned with, won over, shown friendship and compassion, and show friendship and compassion in turn. Gaara still described Shukaku as a grumpy raccoon, but that was leagues better than a year ago, when Gaara had been met with Shukaku's words in his mind. And there was some part of Sakura that wondered if this was some scheme of Shukaku's, some new way of getting to Gaara, but maybe she wanted to believe the best, despite thoughts of the worst. Sakura's styles of taijutsu were basic at best, academy level. She'd never had a taijutsu teacher, and something about Gaara's forms suggested that they wouldn't suit her. She wasn't a bulky, defensive type fighter. If anything, she was finding herself far more offensive, wanting to have the speed to take fights head-on. Her first sparring session with Gaara had been a disaster. They'd both agreed to no jutsu, save the sand Gaara was now keeping around him for weight training, and Sakura hadn't been able to so much as hit Gaara without wincing from the pain of hitting armor. And that, of course, was when she was able to hit him at all. The new forms Gaara was practicing favored swatting her pathetic punches away with ease, and while it taught her to be clever when it came to her hits, it meant that her wrists and hands were sore by the end of the session from how many times Gaara had tagged her. Sakura had lamented, at first, that she would never catch up to Gaara now, not without using some sort of jutsu. And then Oniki had stepped in. He'd watched her for all of a minute before stepping between her and Gaara. He used his small walking cane with surprising dexterity, turning her around and directing her towards a completely different building. "You're not going to build yourself up doing that, Harano." And then the real routine began. Weight training. Lifting, pressing, sit UPS, pull UPS, push UPS, all with Oniki's harsh voice cracking down over her as she worked. Oniki told her what she'd do each day, and she'd do it, until her body felt as though it was going to melt. Earth-style jutsu is about strength. Oniki would lecture. As is any sort of taijutsu that's going to break through Sandboy's little routine. You have the brain to read a situation and figure out the best course of action, but your body isn't ready for it yet. You'll be lifting weights until you can crack Gaara's sand with your bare damn knuckles. Sakura didn't believe that was possible, but she was starting to see why others thought Oniki terrifying, and there was no way she was going to backtalk him now. So began her strength training. Every other day, she'd begin sparring with Gaara, then go straight to training under Oniki until lunchtime. After that came discussion and planning. Oniki, it seemed, had really been thinking of everything when it came to his neutrality project. He had Iwa's dossiers on every cage, information on hidden villages, their trade routes, their borders, their policies, and plans on how best to approach each of them. The Raikage and the Mizu cage will be the most difficult to approach, discounting that bastard of a snake down in Oto. Oniki explained. The Raikage is notoriously protective of his people, and among the most powerful shinobi I know. As for the Mizu cage, no one has heard from him in quite some time. There's rumors of civil war down in Kiri, and if that's the case there's no telling what you'll find once you cross their borders. He'd paused at the time, looking somewhat troubled. Admittedly, IWA might have contributed to some of the chaos. Convincing them to enter any sort of agreement with us will be perhaps the most difficult task you'll face. Sakura had gulped. A secondary task would be finding yourself a base of operations. Oniki continued. If this project is successful, you wouldn't be aligned with any village. You'd need a place to call your home, as well as somewhere to call cages to meeting without anyone fearing attack. A true neutral ground. He'd marked several places on her map. The first was the mountain's graveyard, a large strip of land between Taki and Oto that no shinobi had claimed for generations. There were many who believed it cursed, or guarded by spirits that would kill whomever set foot upon it. A lovely first choice, Sakura had pointed out. Other areas of note were a small island between Kiri and Kumo, and nearby that the small stretch of land where Uzushiagakuer had once stood. There were smaller strips of unclaimed land further inland, but they were typically the sites of border disputes, and the last thing Sakura needed was fighting when she was trying to maintain peace. Better to claim lands no one else had their eye on. In the evenings, Sakura would return with Gaara to their apartment and they would meditate, attempting to increase their chakra stores as well as hone Sakura's sensing jutsu. In the odd days between Sakura's strength training, she was allowed to rest. Oniki stressed the importance of allowing her body a break, as too much strength training would damage rather than toughen her up. But, of course, Sakura wasn't allowed a true rest. Her odd days were spent studying. And this began with Oniki walking her through a mineral museum. Oniki would stop at each exhibit, describing both the various layers of rock and ground that could be found beneath them, as well as the stones and mineral that could be mined from within. He listed every component and what percentage of the earth it made up, where each ratio was most likely to be found, and the physical properties of each. Memorize them, he told Sakura. And that, she could do. Sakura had always been book smart, and she'd grinned from ear to ear when she realized that the little museum had educational books. Though she didn't have much pocket money, she'd bought herself a copy, making sure to study it every night before she went to bed. These lessons, she quickly began to understand. The more she knew about the properties of the earth beneath her, the better equipped she would be to manipulate it. If the ground was soft, she'd need to spend more effort hardening it for her jutsu to be effective. If the ground was hard, it would be more difficult to move. It required perfect control to manipulate all types of earth equally, and Sakura could do control. Sai was with them, always. He wasn't allowed to go elsewhere without armed guard, and Sai seemed content enough just sticking around. Whenever Sakura caught glimpses of the boy, he was always sketching or writing down something. Taking notes for Konoha, no doubt. But he had seemed different since they'd arrived in Iwa, more openly inquisitive. He would ask why Sakura spoke a certain way, why she'd smiled a certain way, why Gaara was always so livid around him. The latter, Sakura still wasn't fully sure, but she was starting to suspect there was more to Gaara's dislike than mere suspicion. She was allowed one weekend day to herself, which she spent getting to know the town of Iwa. The villagers were leery of her at first, but since she was so often seen with the Tsuchikage, it didn't take long for them to warm up. Sakura made a surprising friend in Kuratsuki, whom had certainly been sent to keep an eye on her, but Sakura wasn't going to complain. The woman was a treat to be around. She would show Sakura and the boys a new place to eat every evening, introducing her to the patrons and letting Sakura's name spread around. On her weekends, Kuratsuka would show her village monuments and talk history. I think it would be better to hear about our village through the eyes of an Iwa shinobi, and not your old Konoha dossiers. Kuratsuki had explained. And really, you should try to learn about each village this way. Learn what their enemies have to say, and then learn what they think about themselves. Much like you would an enemy shinobi. There had been two Tsuchikage before Oniki. The first had been Oniki's grandfather, supposedly able to discern the strength and value of any stone simply by looking at it, and had been a prodigy in earth-style jutsu. There was little historical record on him, simply because there was little of the man's time in general. Far more was there on the second Tsuchikage, who interested Sakura far more anyway. The man had been a true shadow, able to wield all 5 elements, revered as a non-person who could completely hide his own chakra signature, and, most interestingly, known for having such a keen sensory jutsu that he could avoid attacks that most shinobi couldn't see coming. Sakura had looked at her own scroll that night, after learning of the second, and wondered briefly if her scroll was of Konoha origin after all. An easy routine. A simple routine. And Sakura wasn't just getting tougher, she was getting smarter. And, more importantly, she felt as though she was learning something else. Something she hadn't necessarily been good at before, getting closer to others. To the villagers. To the Iwa shinobi. To the Tsuchikage. To Sai. To Gaara. In the cold mountains of Iwagakure, maybe she was getting strong. For the first time in his life, Gaara was truly and consistently happy. He could live here forever in Iwa, training with Sakura, learning about the village, and spending his nights in the company of Han. And occasionally Rashi. Even if it hadn't been where he'd grown up, even if he hadn't been here long, this place was more of a home than Suna had ever been. Akatsuki meant nothing. The looming danger of it all, nothing. Here, he was happy. Though the nights were cold, they were never long enough. Gaara would perch on the roof of their apartment and wait, and Han would eventually appear in a flurry of snow and earth. The man liked talking, and Gaara liked listening. When he'd told Sakura of the appearance of the two Jinhuriki, she'd been happy for him. Make friends with them, Gaara. Learn as much as you can. They're like you, after all. Gaara had originally thought Sakura would want to take point regarding Han and Rashi, but she seemed more than content to let him build the relationship, and for that he was grateful. It worked out, in the end. Han and Rashi were a careful lot, with Rashi being distrustworthy of pretty much anyone besides Han, and Han only really speaking with Gaara because they had a kinship in their positions, which Rashi could grudgingly accept. Gaara had never seen two men as close as they. We needed each other. Han explained. The village has no love for us, so we had to have love for each other. He gave his trademark smile, barely visible behind his thick armor. Rashi wouldn't have it, at first. He was slightly older than myself. He'd dealt with things longer. At the time, he told me, there was no such thing as camaraderie, so we had to look out for ourselves. Gaara was more than intimately familiar with such a mindset. How did you change his mind? I didn't give up. Han said simply. And I proved him wrong by looking out for him. It was so simple it was almost laughable, but Gaara understood. Sakura, she'd been there. She had just been there. And that had been enough. Occasionally, Han would take him to a small cave on the outskirts of the village. There was a quiet pool near the back of the cave, kept clear with a small trickle of running water that came down from the mountain top. The trickle echoed through the cave rhythmically, and Gaara couldn't help but feel a sense of peace when he was by the pool. Near there was where the two Jinhuriki made their home, and the cave itself was somewhere that the two used for meditating. Mostly me. Han admitted with a shrug. Rashi isn't really the type to sit down for more than 5 minutes. But you wondered how I communicated so much with Kokuo, and this is how. I sit here when I need the quiet, and I can speak with him. I've spoken with Shukaku all my life, but only recently have I ever seen him. Gaara replied. I think he's the one that tends to drag me in. Means the boy's seal is shit. Rashi commented brusquely. Shouldn't be able to communicate with your beast so easily unless you will it. I told you the boy was a damn problem, Hoshi. Ichiban's going to break out in the middle of the goddamn night and kill us all. Not so long as I don't fall asleep. Oh, that's extremely reassuring. With that, Han had prodded until Gaara sat down and showed Han the location of his seal. Both Jinhuriki examined him, and he heard several hums of discontent. Gaara had known his seal was shoddy for a while, but the extent of it seemed to consistently surprise others. There's only one thing you can do unless you can find a seal master. Han concluded. And that's make sure Shukaku doesn't ever have a reason to violently break free. And what can I do to ensure that? Make friends with him. Gaara could not consider Shukaku a friend. He could barely consider the beast a teacher. Years of hearing his whispers, of killing for him, of being driven further and further into darkness, how could Gaara trust Shukaku, let alone befriend him? And for that matter, how could he convince the beast that friendship was worth investing in? You don't give up. Han reminded him. And thus, Gaara's own project began. It was a difficult project, given that Shukaku knew about it. At first, Shukaku insisted on keeping their relationship business professional. Gaara was there to learn, Shukaku was there to make sure he didn't die young. But Gaara didn't give up. For several hours, every night, he sat in the small cave and meditated. And every night, once he found himself within Shukaku's massive chamber, he badgered the beast with questions. How long have you been alive? Do you have parents? Can you use any of the 5 elemental chakra? Where did you live, before Suna? Shukaku was tight-lipped, at first ignoring Gaara before eventually outwardly berating him for being an annoyance. Gaara only managed to get one question answered in his time. Has there ever been a human that you've liked? 1. Shukaku answered. Though calling him human is a bit of a stretch. Hagoromo was infinitely more interesting than any of the rest of you ants scurrying around. The name Hagoromo wasn't familiar to Gaara, but that didn't mean he couldn't dedicate some of his hours to researching it. And perhaps, if he looked for long enough, Shukaku might be kind enough to chip in. Fortunately, he didn't have to look long, for it was Han that actually knew of the name. The Sage of Six Paths. Han explained. Kokuo speaks fondly of him, but little more than that. And from Rashi's brief conversations with Son Goku, we can assume all of the tailed beasts were familiar with Hagoromo. Of course, getting Rashi and Son Goku to communicate at all is difficult. Gaara didn't doubt that. The Sage of Six Paths. Gaara knew enough about history to know that this Hagoromo was the ancestor of all shinobi, the supposed origin of chakra, and someone whose power had never been replicated in the generations that came after him. That the beasts were familiar with him indicated that the beasts were ancient. Gaara couldn't imagine living for such a long time, seeing all of history slowly go by. And in a way, he could understand why Shukaku might be cynical. After a brutal warring era, followed by 3 shinobi world wars, humanity had to seem pretty violent. Not just that, but we must seem like children in comparison. Sakura had pointed out when Gaara had told her about the sage. I mean, from all I remember reading anyway, the sage had access to the Rinnegan eyes, which can supposedly create or destroy on a whim. Not even the Sharingan is that impressive. And nobody's wielded the Rinnegan since. No one in all of history. It seemed strange. Unlikely that history wouldn't repeat itself. But clearly there were things Gaara was missing, and Shukaku's lips were sealed. So while Gaara was not going to relent in his goal of getting on Shukaku's good side, he spent more of his time befriending the Jinchuriki. And in similar manner, Gaara decided that he was going to specifically befriend Rashi. Han, thankfully, was all too eager to help. Bring him breakfast, he suggested. Bacon, eggs, pancakes, the works. He's never upset when he has breakfast. It was true, Gaara found out. It got Rashi to stay in his presence long enough to see the man's face go from angry to neutral. Each day was another challenge in this new life of making friendships. Each day was another training session, with Sakura, or Shukaku, getting stronger. Each day. Gaara was happy. No, Gaara, not like that. Put your knuckles closer to the ground, and then flick. It'll make the marble go further. Sai watched as Sakura Haruno and the Ichibai crouched on a flat plot of ground. A crude circle had been drawn in the dirt, and a collection of brilliantly colored marbles had been set up in the center. Sakura and Gaara each started with a single marble. The goal, Sai had deduced, was to knock as many marbles out of the circle with the starting marble as possible. A child's game. He had seen it once or twice patrolling Konoha, but had never had interest until now. Why did the two waste time on such frivolous games when they could be occupying themselves with something more productive? But he couldn't deny that the smile on Sakura's face was genuine as she explained the rules, and he couldn't deny that, for a brief moment, he'd seen a hint of a smile on Gaara's face as they played. So strange, Sai thought. Such legitimate smiles. He'd been placed on probation, allowed to wander unchained in IWA so long as he was near either Sakura or an IWA shinobi. It suited him fine. He was supposed to keep watch over Sakura anyway, and if she was going to waste hours on a child's game, that made it easier for him. It also gave him time to draw. Free drawing was something he rarely had the time for. Art was his jutsu, art made him valuable to Root, but it was never meant to be for himself. Yet, there was no real reason for him to spend time sketching Sakura and Gaara, other than for himself. Root already knew what the two looked like, and drawings of them playing games would be considered laughable. But Sai was drawn to the picture, drawn to sketching it over and over again until he could invoke whatever feeling watching the two brought him. And there was a feeling, something he'd buried but was threatening to burst out of his seams unless he could just. He watched as Sakura gently took hold of Gaara's hand, showing him the best way to flick. They were from separate villages, by all accounts polar opposites, and yet they moved around each other like they had known each other all their lives. And all at once, he remembered. He remembered how his book was supposed to end. Time seemed to slow down as he pulled his book out, flipping to the middle page. He remembered. Two hands touching. Two brothers. Two people, having known each other all their lives, fighting, getting stronger, and then pain, and he pushed that down on instinct, couldn't think about it, couldn't dwell on it. Their hands, together, as they met after their many trials and tribulations. Sai sketched furiously, not wanting to forget the image now that he had it. He didn't even realize that Sakura and Gaara had caught sight of him, and had come over for a closer look. He just had to finish it. For him. For him. I like it, Sakura said, jolting him out of his thoughts. They meet together at the end and become friends. Sai looked down at his picture again, and felt something that could only be described as bittersweet. It's just a fairy tale, Sai said simply. Friendship only happens in fairy tales, fisticuffs. It's a silly book. I don't think so. She held out a hand to him, with a single marble in it. You could play too, you know. He didn't. He couldn't. He wasn't supposed to feel. Wasn't supposed to remember. But fuck it all, he wanted to anyway. Sakura. There was another knock on the door, and Sakura yawned as she opened it. It was a rest day, thankfully, but that didn't mean her training hadn't left her sore. What is it? She asked, surprised to see Kuratsuka there so early. Get dressed. There's something you'll want to see. Several minutes later, Sakura had pulled on her clothes, tied her hair back, and woken Sai for their surprise morning trip. It was a cold morning, the near dead of winter now, and the sun had barely begun to rise over the nearby mountain peaks. Patrol caught someone rushing to the village borders this morning, Kuratsuki explained as they walked. An enemy shinobi, and a nasty strong one at that. It took a dozen shinobi to get him tied up, and we're still not sure we have him fully contained. But what we do know is that ever since he woke up, he's been asking to speak with you. Me? Sakura blinked in confusion. Why me? Maybe it's better if you see who it is. You might know more than we do. Kuratsuka led her down below the ground level of the village, to what Sakura deduced had to be prisons and interrogation rooms. The Tsuchikage was waiting for them, along with several other menacing shinobi who parted for her as she walked by. Don't let sentiment get the better of you, Harino. Figure out why he's here for us and we won't have to get dirty. Oniki told her. We're trying to start alliances here, not wars, and if Konoha is going to make things difficult we need to know. Wait, Konoha? Sakura didn't wait for another second. With Gaara trailing behind her, she made her way into the prison room. A man sat in front of her, tied down to a chair. A Konoha headband was pulled down over one eye, and a shock of silver hair flopped down over the man's head. His single, uncovered eye looked up at her with a mixture of both shock and relief. Sakura. Sakura took a minute to take in the image of her old sensei, tied up in front of her, exhausted but, here. Why was he here? Had he followed her all this way, all this time? She folded her arms, but she couldn't help but give him a small smile. Hello, Kakashi-sensei. Check the description for the links to the author.